The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
6 days after Peter had acknowledged Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. As he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up. Do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. For the past 2 weeks, I have been following an extraordinary journey. The son of some parishioners that I had back in Toledo, had the honor of just being with this family. Their son is celebrating 60 years of life, 40 years of sobriety, and was climbing to base camp of Everest. He made it, okay? We'll cut to the chase. He made it to base camp. Now, friends, it's February. Everest season is May usually, but he knew that he wasn't going to be going beyond base camp, and he was willing to be out and be in the cold in order to do this. And what was even more extraordinary was one point when I said something, he's posting all these amazing photos and the story on Facebook, and I made a comment, and he replied. Now, I'm sorry, I'm old enough to think that's absolutely amazing. It's like, he said this from Mount Everest. He said this from Mount Everest. Now, the sky was extraordinary. I don't know, the color of blue I've never seen before. But the other thing that he kept on posting was pictures and pictures and pictures of the trail, the rocks, the scree, these frightening bridges. You know those like really narrow sort of metal swaying things? Yeah, those. Yeah, I looked at that and said, why don't you stick to, I'm going to stick to scuba diving. And he is a scuba diver, which made this journey even more unusual. But what he said, people are commenting about all this. And what he said was frequently on the trail, all of my courage came from following the one ahead of me, the guide, the Sherpa. And Sherpas, by the way, are not just people who lug loads, okay? They're guides. They're the wisdom of the mountain, the wisdom of those trails. And so there were many times that what he did was simply look at the one in front of him and follow. Look at the one in front of him and listen. So I think about this as I read this morning's gospel and the Old Testament lesson. Perhaps we don't give enough credit for those little taglines of, oh, Moses went up the mountain, and oh, Jesus, took Peter, James, and John and went up the mountain. The mountain that Jesus, Peter, James, and John go up today is most likely Mount Hermon, which is about 9,000 feet high, otherwise known as halfway to base camp. But that's high. And you can imagine back then they didn't have hiking boots. They probably had, some fortified shoes, a little bit, but poles. And I bet there was a lot of scree, a lot of rock, a lot of worry getting up that mountain. So they get up there. It's not as though a helicopter dropped them down. They're tired, probably a little scared, and you're very exposed out on that mountain. And suddenly, something happens. This isn't the usual weather on top of this mountain, however unpredictable that weather may be. And there is Moses, and there is Elijah. Moses, who has been getting the law in the Old Testament lesson that we read this morning. Sidebar, do you remember what happened after Moses went down the mountain? Golden calf. Did they get it right the first time? No. To be continued on that line. And there's Elijah. And you know what? What Peter does is absolutely faithful. Now, some of my colleagues don't like how I interpret Peter. But how many scientists do we have in this congregation? When you have an experiment and you do something and you don't get the results you anticipate, is it a failure or is it data? Thank you. I think Peter would have been totally at home here, okay? It's data, friends. And Peter does what is absolutely faithful. It's not that he doesn't get it, it's that he does. And he says, let's build 3 booths. Now those booths, that is from one of the oldest Jewish feasts called Sukkot. And these booths, they're not a permanent structure. They are very temporary, and for 8 days, Jews are supposed to eat their meals in them and even sleep in them. And the tops of those booths that Peter so wants to have here cannot even have all of the top totally sealed, but have the sky deliberately exposed. And all of this is so that the people of God remember their smallness in the universe, their mercy that they rely on. And they can look up, and they can pray, and they can dream, and they can hope. And also in this feast, one of the most primary points is to welcome back the memories of your ancestors, to honor those who have come before you. And here are the greatest. And Peter doesn't say just one for Moses and one for Elijah, but one for Jesus as well. What he says is absolutely faithful. What he says is how they worshiped and how they went before. And what happens next? A bright cloud. A bright cloud. And out of this cloud, God doesn't say no. God says, this is my son. This is the beloved. And what does he say next? Listen to him. Listen to him. And they look up, and only Jesus is there, which means the law and the prophets are now within him. And then he says, get up and do not be afraid. He touches them. He touches them and says this. It is not that what Peter did was unfaithful. It's just time to do it a new way. And you know where I'm heading. All of us, in all of our churches, for so many years, have been so faithful. Have been so faithful. And as I've said before, a reformation seems to come along about every 500 years. That means if you go back that when Jesus was there was one of those reformations. Middle Ages, Reformation, and here we are. Right in the middle of a bright cloud. Right in the middle of a time that we are trying to be faithful. But I believe God is saying, wait a minute. What you're doing has been so good for so long. And now I'm going to ask you to do a new, old thing. This is my beloved. Listen to him. One more time, listen to him. Know that all that we have been doing is good and right and faithful, and we get to listen anew for God's call to follow Christ in a new way. Now here's the hard part. We don't know what that is yet. You've been on mountains, most of you, many of you have been on some kind of a mountain before. Did you walk up? Did you walk down? When is it more nerve-wracking? Down. Going down, right? Thank you. I can tell you're real hikers out here. Yes. Going down. You still have the scree. You still have the rocks. And now you're kind of tired. And now you're a little distracted with everything that you've learned on that mountain. So it's all right to take it slow. To be a little careful. But to keep going. Keep going where we are needed. And before we worship the old way, we get to listen. And we get to follow in the new way. And we get to listen and watch and maybe get it wrong a time or two. It's not bad, it's just data. Now we know a way not to do it. Okay, we learned. Now we learned another way not to do it. Okay. And here's Peter in this letter, or a friend of Peter's, saying, this is what we learned. Took a little while, but now look what's happening to the faith. We still have a lot of miles in us, friends. And I know that most of you are pretty strong. Don't sell yourselves short. Listen. And when you start running out of courage, look at the one who's right in front of you. That is our Lord, who doesn't go too far ahead of us, but who leads us, who touches us, who encourages us, and for whose love we always climb.